Late 1944, inside a dimly lit command tent somewhere in France, General George S. Patton is running his finger across a massive master operational map, charting the route for an imminent armored advance. Around him, 30 senior officers, colonels, lieutenant colonels, majors, stand in absolute disciplined silence. No one speaks unless spoken to. No one questions the route. Then, a voice from the very back wall cuts through the heavy air. A 22-year-old enlisted corporal, the lowest-ranking man in the room, steps forward. "Sir," he says, "I think the map is wrong." The silence in the room instantly turns suffocating. The young corporal has just publicly contradicted the most feared and volatile commander in the United States military. If he is wrong, his career is over. If he is right, the entire Third Army is currently planning to drive a massive armored column into a dead end. This is the story of Corporal Daniel Kovac. Before the Army, his life revolved around the precise, unforgiving reality of terrain. Now, his quiet civilian expertise was colliding head-on with the rigid, rank-obsessed hierarchy of the United States military. We are going to look at how a tiny cartographic discrepancy on a piece of paper threatened to completely derail a major armored advance. In a military structure where rank dictates who speaks and who listens, objective truth can easily be buried. But in this exact moment, speaking that truth to a man everyone else feared was the only way to prevent a logistical catastrophe and save American lives. It is a story about a fundamental clash present in every war, the strict chain of command versus the undeniable physical reality of the battlefield. You can have the most disciplined, well-equipped army on the planet, but if the map does not match the Earth always wins. But to truly grasp the sheer terror of Kovac's interruption, to understand why every senior officer in that tent suddenly stopped breathing, you first have to understand the specific environment he was standing in. And more importantly, you have to understand the terrifying reputation of the general he had just interrupted. The Third Army Command Post in the autumn of 1944 was not a place for collaborative brainstorming. It was the nerve center of the most aggressive, fast-moving mechanized force on the European continent. Housed in requisitioned buildings or sprawling canvas tents, these briefing rooms were defined by a suffocating, impenetrable hierarchy. When the commanding general stood before the master operational map, the space transformed into a theater of absolute authority. The men flanking the planning tables were not junior lieutenants fresh from training. They were seasoned field-grade officers, colonels and majors with decades of service, chests covered in ribbons, and immense operational responsibilities. Yet in this specific room, under the harsh glare of bare, incandescent bulbs, these veteran officers routinely sweated through their tailored uniform shirts. They were terrified, and for good reason. General George S. Patton commanded the room not just by the weight of his 3 stars, but through a volatile, uncompromising personality that had become legendary across the theater. Patton was undeniably brilliant, a master of mobile warfare who understood the geometry of pursuit better than almost anyone in the Allied High Command. But he was also notoriously impatient, deeply intimidating, and prone to explosive outbursts that could end a career in a single sentence. He demanded absolute perfection and relentless forward momentum. In Patton's Third Army, you did not offer excuses, you did not highlight difficulties, and you certainly did not interrupt the commander when he was dictating the tempo of the next offensive. The pressure in these briefings was compounded by the unforgiving mathematics of mechanized warfare. By late 1944, time had become the ultimate enemy. The Allied advance across France was a logistical high-wire act, a massive, grinding machine that consumed thousands of gallons of gasoline, tons of ammunition, and countless rations every single day. To maintain the rapid offensive that Patton demanded, movement had to be synchronized with flawless precision. Operational planners relied on intricate march tables, complex schedules that dictated exactly which armored division, which infantry regiment, and which supply convoy would occupy a specific stretch of road at a specific minute of the day. A mechanized army is not a fluid entity. It is a lumbering, heavy beast, bound by the physical constraints of asphalt, mud, and bridges. If a single column of Sherman tanks and motorized infantry took a wrong turn or arrived at a bottleneck that could not support their weight, the resulting traffic jam would not just delay one unit, it would ripple backward through the entire logistics chain. Miles of vehicles would stack up bumper to bumper on narrow French country roads, sitting idle, burning precious fuel, and transforming into a stationary target for German artillery or Luftwaffe strafing runs. A logistical failure was not a mere inconvenience, it was a tactical catastrophe that cost blood. Because the stakes were so incredibly high, the military hierarchy was rigidly enforced to maintain order and discipline. The chain of command was designed to process information from the top down. A commanding general assessed the strategic picture, issued the directive, and the staff officers translated that directive into actionable orders. It was a system built on obedience. The distance between a 3-star commanding general and a 22-year-old enlisted corporal was not measured in the physical feet that separated them across the canvas floor of the briefing tent. It was measured in an entire, towering command structure. A corporal existed in a fundamentally different universe than a general. His job was strictly to update the acetate overlays with grease pencils, pin the unit markers to the board, and remain completely invisible. This immense disparity in rank created a dangerous psychological dynamic within the command post. The pressure to agree with the commander was absolute. When a man like Patton outlined a plan of attack, tracing his finger along a designated route of advance, the natural instinct of every officer in the room was to validate that plan. To raise a hand and point out a flaw was to invite the wrath of a man who equated hesitation with cowardice. It was far safer for a colonel's career to silently nod, approve the march tables, and hope any minor geographical problems could be sorted out by the company commanders on the ground. But the deadly cost of moving an army based on bad intelligence always fell on the men at the front. The staff officers might survive a bad planning session, but the soldiers, sealed inside the steel hulls of armored vehicles, or the infantrymen shivering in the back of 2.5-ton trucks, would pay the ultimate price for a staff officer's silence. If the master map was wrong, the army was blind. And yet, the climate of fear within the 3rd Army headquarters meant that objective reality was often suppressed in favor of rank. On this particular evening, as Patton finalized the routing for the upcoming armored thrust, the atmosphere was suffocating. The seasoned colonels flanking the table examined the route. They looked at the primary roads, the bypasses, the choke points. Some of them, perhaps, possessed enough experience to feel a vague sense of unease about the cartography of the sector. The French road networks were notoriously tricky, often realigned or rebuilt without the Allied intelligence maps being properly updated. But to speak up required a level of moral courage that superseded the basic instinct for professional self-preservation. In an atmosphere where decorated battalion commanders chose their words with extreme, calculated caution, directly questioning the operational blueprint was entirely unthinkable. It was a perfect storm of military dysfunction, a brilliant but terrifying commander, a high-stakes armored advance dependent on flawless synchronization, and a room full of officers paralyzed by the hierarchy they served. The machine was about to be set into motion. The orders were minutes away from being typed, duplicated, and dispatched to the armored spearheads waiting in the mud. Millions of pounds of steel and thousands of young men were about to be hurled toward a specific grid coordinate simply because no one in the room had the authority or the nerve to say otherwise. No one, except the lowest-ranking man standing near the canvas wall. A junior enlisted man who was never supposed to speak, but who had spent his civilian life reading the earth, and who now saw a lethal discrepancy on the paper that everyone else was too terrified to mention. The master operational map hanging under the harsh lighting of the command tent was not an abstract sketch. It was a printed promises of reality. It laid out roads, elevations, rail lines, and choke points that dictated how an entire armored corps would surge toward its objective. But behind the crisp grid lines and clear ink of this specific blueprint lay a fundamental, hidden flaw. The map being used to route the Third Army's forward elements relied on outdated French topographical surveys. Specifically, the cartographic baseline was drawn from documentation compiled years prior to the outbreak of the war. What the planners at the headquarters level did not realize, or had failed to cross-reference, was that during the mid-1930s, the local French department had undertaken a massive civil engineering project following a devastating regional flood. The overflowing river systems had severely compromised the old road infrastructure, forcing engineers to completely restructure the valley's transit network. Rivers were dredged, new stone culverts were constructed, and the original country lanes were permanently abandoned. More importantly, the primary intersection, the precise road junction where the advance was scheduled to split into a two-pronged movement, had been entirely bypassed. Under the new post-flood layout, the actual usable junction had been constructed nearly a mile to the southwest of where the old road once stood. On paper, Patton's grease pencil was marking a route that seamlessly connected a major paved artery directly to a reinforced concrete bridge. In reality, that specific junction no longer existed in functional space. The original route ended abruptly at a steep drainage embankment and a swampy, overgrown floodplain. This was not a minor drafting error, it was a structural trap. The operational order called for hundreds of medium tanks, half-tracks, heavy artillery tractors, and motorized infantry trucks to pass through this exact point in the pitch blackness of early morning. An armored column in motion is a rigid, massive kinetic engine. It does not turn around easily on narrow rural roads lined with deep drainage ditches. If the lead tank of a 2-mile-long column arrives at a non-existent intersection, it cannot simply pull a U-turn and find another way. The moment the point vehicle stops, every single transport behind it grinds to a halt in a cascading chain reaction. Within minutes, thousands of tons of heavy equipment become completely immobilized on a narrow strip of asphalt. The column transforms from an aggressive, fast-moving spearhead into a static, helpless parking lot stretched across the French countryside. And in late 1944, a stationary armored column was a death sentence. An immobilized formation on a known access road was precisely what German artillery spotters and localized defense units were trained to exploit. A few well-aimed shells on the lead and rear vehicles would instantly lock the entire unit in place, turning a routine movement into a catastrophic bottleneck. The margin for error was non-existent, yet the Third Army was minutes away from issuing an order built on phantom geography. To understand the sheer lethality of phantom geography, it is necessary to first understand the complex, unforgiving anatomy of an American armored division on the move in the late autumn of 1944. A combat command thrust was not a swift, agile, or easily maneuverable entity. It was a massive, creeping industrial city rolling on continuous steel tracks and heavy synthetic rubber tires. When a commander like Patton ordered a mechanized advance, he was setting in motion thousands of discrete, tightly packed vehicles. An armored column consisted of 30-ton M4 Sherman tanks, open-topped M3 half-tracks loaded with mechanized infantry, heavy artillery tractors towing 105mm howitzers, self-propelled tank destroyers, heavily laden fuel bowsers, and endless lines of 2.5-ton GMC supply trucks. The rural road networks of eastern France were fundamentally incompatible with this staggering scale of mechanized warfare. These agricultural routes were designed decades, sometimes centuries earlier, for horse-drawn carts and light local traffic. A typical French country lane was often barely wide enough for 2 civilian cars to pass each other safely. They were frequently bordered by ancient, impenetrable hedgerows, thick stone farm walls, or steep, muddy drainage ditches designed to funnel away the heavy autumn rains. When a Sherman tank, measuring over 8 feet wide, drives down one of these narrow lanes, it dominates the entire navigable surface of the road. Now multiply that single tank by hundreds of vehicles. To minimize their vulnerability to strafing runs by the Luftwaffe or sudden artillery strikes, military doctrine dictated specific, staggered intervals between each vehicle, effectively stretching a single armored column for miles across the countryside. But this immense, heavy steel serpent had one critical structural vulnerability. It could only move in one direction, forward. Reversing a multi-mile armored column in hostile territory is a physical and logistical impossibility. A driver sealed inside the buttoned-up hull of a Sherman tank has virtually zero rearward visibility, relying entirely on narrow periscopes that only look ahead. You cannot simply radio a 2-mile convoy of mixed armor and supply trucks and tell them to put their transmissions in reverse. If the point element of the column, the lead reconnaissance jeeps and the vanguard tanks, arrives at a dead end, a collapsed bridge, or a road junction that simply does not exist, the kinetic energy of the entire operation collapses instantly. The vehicles behind the vanguard, often operating under strict radio silence protocols or communicating on tightly compartmentalized company nets, are unaware of the stoppage at the front. They continue to press forward, closing the tactical gaps between their bumpers. Within 10 to 15 minutes, the entire column compresses into a solid, unmoving block of metal. It becomes a parking lot. Thousands of engines sit idling, burning precious high-octane aviation fuel and diesel, while the heavy tracks sink slowly into the soft mud. There is absolutely no room to maneuver, no room to pivot the hulls, and no space to deploy into defensive combat formations off the road. They are physically trapped by the very terrain they are attempting to conquer. In the European theater of operations, this specific scenario was not merely an inconvenience. It was a catastrophic tactical situation that the German military had spent years perfecting how to exploit. By late 1944, The Wehrmacht was fighting a desperate, defensive war of attrition. German high command knew they could no longer match the overwhelming American industrial output or armored numbers in an open-field brawl. Instead, German tactical doctrine relied heavily on utilizing the complex European terrain to create artificial, inescapable kill zones. German artillery observers, forward reconnaissance units, and panzer grenadier detachments meticulously mapped the natural choke points of the French countryside. They knew exactly where the roads narrowed into defiles. They knew where the ancient stone bridges could not support the weight of a Sherman tank. They knew where the marshlands and flooded fields prevented any possibility of off-road flanking maneuvers. They did not just wait for the advancing Americans to make a navigational mistake. They built their entire defensive strategy around anticipating and exploiting one. When an American column stalled at a geographical bottleneck, the German response was immediate, rehearsed, and mathematically merciless. Forward artillery observers, often heavily camouflaged in hillside bunkers, church steeples, or dense tree lines, maintained direct field telephone contact with battery commanders stationed miles behind the front lines. These batteries had already pre-calculated the exact firing coordinates for every major crossroad and choke point in the sector. The moment a traffic jam formed, the trap was sprung. Pre-registered artillery, ranging from rapid-firing mortar teams to deadly 88mm dual-purpose flak guns and massive 150mm heavy field howitzers, would open fire simultaneously. The German ambush doctrine was ruthlessly simple. Destroy the point vehicle to permanently seal the front of the column, destroy the rear vehicle to completely block any avenue of retreat, and then systematically annihilate everything trapped in the middle. The American armor, unable to turn their turrets effectively in the narrow space, or angle their sloped frontal armor to face the incoming threat, would be methodically picked apart. The American infantry, pinned inside open-topped half-tracks or huddling under the canvas covers of troop transports, would be shredded by airburst artillery shells designed to rain lethal shrapnel downward. A simple navigation error on a staff officer's map would not just result in a delayed timetable, it was mathematically guaranteed to result in the complete operational destruction of an entire combat command, transforming a quiet country road into a slaughterhouse within less than an hour. This was the catastrophic, ticking reality suspended by a fragile thread inside the 3rd Army command tent. If the master operational map was wrong, the Army was blindly driving into a pre-surveyed graveyard, and the only person in the room who recognized that the thread was snapping was a 22-year-old enlisted corporal whose name none of the senior officers even knew. Corporal Daniel Kovac did not fit the traditional mold of a hardened combat veteran or a West Point-educated tactical strategist. He was a draftee, placed in the headquarters staff strictly because of a highly specialized, highly technical civilian background. Before the outbreak of the war, Kovac had not been studying military tactics, infantry maneuvers, or combined arms doctrine. He had been studying the earth. He worked extensively in the meticulous fields of civilian land surveying and civil engineering. During the Great Depression, massive public works projects and infrastructure overhauls across the United States required veritable armies of surveyors to map the American landscape with excruciating mathematical precision. Kovac had spent his formative professional years staring through the precision optics of a Keufel and Esser transit level, measuring exact elevations with stadia rods, calculating datum planes, hammering benchmarks into the bedrock, and drafting highly detailed topographical maps. In the unforgiving world of civilian engineering, a map was never treated as an abstract illustration or a mere suggestion of the landscape. It was a legally binding contract with the physical topography of the Earth. If a surveyor was wrong by a fraction of a single degree, a steel suspension bridge would not meet in the center, a newly laid railroad track would derail its freight, or a concrete hydroelectric dam would fail to hold back the water. Because of the absolute zero-tolerance nature of his profession, Kovac had developed a deeply ingrained, almost obsessive professional habit. He never trusted any cartographic document at face value. Before he looked at the contour lines, the road networks, or the boundary markers, he always scrutinized the marginalia. He meticulously checked the tiny, easily ignored text printed at the bottom corners of the document. He verified the publication dates, the magnetic declination variances, the scale ratios, and, most importantly, the source origins of the survey data. He knew fundamentally that the Earth was a dynamic, constantly shifting entity. Rivers eroded their banks, Massive floods washed away entire valleys, and human engineering constantly altered the landscape to adapt to nature. To a trained civilian surveyor, relying on a 10-year-old map to navigate a modern, high-speed mechanical system was the absolute height of professional negligence. Now, standing motionless in the deep shadows of the command tent, Kovach's civilian instincts were screaming at him like a physical alarm. As General Patton's heavy grease pencil confidently traced the bold blue line of the intended armored advance across the acetate overlay, Kovach had been staring intensely at the underlying topography printed on the paperboard. The grid coordinates, the spacing of the contour lines, the specific winding curve of the river valley, they all triggered a profound, immediate sense of recognition. He wasn't just looking at a generic, unnamed sector of the French countryside. He was looking at a specific regional topology he had studied extensively back in the United States. Prior to the outbreak of the war, while analyzing European civil engineering methodologies for advanced flood control systems, Kovach had read detailed, highly technical engineering journals regarding a massive public works initiative in this exact French department. He remembered the specific documents detailing the aftermath of a devastating, region-wide flood that had occurred in the mid-1930s. The overflowing river systems had completely washed away the ancient infrastructure, severely compromising the old road network and forcing the local French civil engineers to completely restructure the valley's transit routes. Rivers were aggressively dredged and realigned, massive new stone culverts were constructed, and the original, vulnerable country lanes were permanently abandoned to the marshland. More importantly, Kovach knew that the primary intersection, the precise road junction where the American armored advance was scheduled to split into a massive two-pronged movement, had been entirely bypassed by the French engineers. Under the new, post-flood layout, the actual usable road junction had been constructed on higher, stable ground nearly a mile to the southwest of where the old road once stood. Kovach's eyes darted urgently from the general's grease pencil to the bottom right corner of the master operational map. The tiny, faded text of the cartographic legend confirmed his absolute worst fear. The base topographical data for the map the Third Army was using was credited to a French geographical survey that had been completed and published in 1932. It was entirely blind to the catastrophic flood, it was blind to the destroyed roads, and it was completely blind to the newly constructed concrete bypass. On paper, Patton's grease pencil was marking a route that seamlessly connected a major paved artery directly to a reinforced bridge. In reality, that specific junction no longer existed in functional space. The original route ended abruptly at a steep, impassable drainage embankment, leading straight into a swampy, overgrown floodplain. The map currently dominating the attention of the Third Army's senior staff was depicting a ghost network. It was a beautiful, meticulously drawn, and entirely fictitious illustration of a world that had been washed away a decade earlier. The route Patton was so confidently assigning to his vanguard armor did not lead to a strategic crossroads. It led to a literal dead end. It was a lethal topographical trap, mathematically guaranteed to stall the column, trigger the accordion effect, and expose thousands of American soldiers to the pre-registered guns of waiting German artillery spotters. The realization hit Kovach with the physical, breath-stealing force of a blow to the chest. He looked around the dimly lit canvas room. 30 senior officers stood in absolute silence. Decades of combined, highly decorated military experience, rows of polished silver eagles and gold oak leaves gleaming under the harsh incandescent bulbs, and not a single one of them was looking at the marginalia. They were looking at the grease pencil. They were looking at the commanding general. They were looking at the intricate march tables and the ticking clock. The operational orders were in the final, irreversible stages of being synchronized. The movement directives were minutes away from being typed, carbon copied, and physically dispatched by motorcycle couriers to the armored spearheads waiting in the freezing mud outside. In a matter of minutes, the logistical coordination would be permanently locked, and the fate of the armored column would be sealed. Millions of pounds of steel, thousands of gallons of volatile fuel, and thousands of young men were about to be hurled toward a specific grid coordinate simply because a piece of paper said it was safe. Kovach was a corporal. The United States military machine had spent months in basic training violently drilling into him the absolute, unquestionable necessity of staying in his lane, following the chain of command, and keeping his mouth shut in the presence of superior officers. The distance between his rank and the men standing around the table was insurmountable. But the surveyor in him, the meticulous civilian engineer who understood the uncompromising, deadly physics of terrain, could not allow the math to be ignored. The ground did not care about military rank, and the ground was about to kill his fellow soldiers. He stepped forward, his boots making a faint, sharp sound against the wooden floorboards of the tent. The words left his mouth before his military conditioning could completely paralyze his vocal cords. "Sir, I think the map is wrong." The immediate aftermath of that single sentence was a physical, concussive shockwave of silence. It was not just quiet, it was the sudden, breathless, terrifying vacuum that instantly precedes a massive detonation. Every single head in the briefing tent snapped violently toward the back wall. The seasoned colonels literally stopped breathing. The majors froze in place, their grease pencils hovering millimeters above their notebooks. In the rigid, terrifying ecosystem of the 3rd Army headquarters, a junior enlisted man had just interrupted the commanding general in the middle of an operational briefing to tell him he was making a mistake. Kovac stood his ground, his heart hammering violently against his ribs, bracing for the legendary volcanic eruption that George S. Patton was famous for. Patton was a man who had notoriously slapped soldiers in medical tents for perceived cowardice. He was a commander who regularly stripped field officers of their commands on the spot for minor infractions. To contradict him publicly in front of his entire senior staff was considered absolute professional suicide. The air in the tent grew incredibly heavy, thick with the terrifying anticipation of a roaring tirade, an immediate court-martial, and a brutal, career-ending dressing down that would verbally annihilate the young corporal and banish him to a frontline rifle squad. The seconds stretched into an excruciating eternity. Kovac felt the crushing, suffocating weight of the military hierarchy pressing down on his shoulders, but he did not break eye contact, anchored only by the absolute, unshakable certainty of his civilian engineering knowledge. The map was a lie, and the ground was the truth. Finally, the commanding general turned his body fully away from the planning board. Patton slowly lowered his grease pencil. He stepped past the ring of paralyzed, sweating colonels, his polished cavalry boots echoing sharply in the suffocating silence. He closed the distance, stopping just inches from the 22-year-old enlisted man. The sheer physical presence of the general was overwhelming, radiating a terrifying, focused intensity as he locked his piercing eyes onto Kovac's face. But instead of the explosive, career-ending screaming that every senior officer in the room was bracing for, Patton delivered something entirely different. He issued a short, quiet command that instantly shattered the tension and fundamentally shifted the entire dynamic of the room. "Show me." Two quiet, sharp words. Not a threat of a court-martial, not a screaming dismissal, just a demand for hard proof. As the 22-year-old corporal steps past the ring of frozen, sweating senior officers to approach the master planning table, the true nature of the crisis inside that tent becomes terrifyingly clear. The most dangerous threat to the 3rd Army that night was not the outdated French topographical survey hanging on the board. It was the deadly, suffocating culture of silence that inevitably infects rigid military hierarchies. Look at the men standing in that room. 30 field-grade officers, decorated combat veterans, logistics chiefs, and intelligence officers whose sole responsibility was to ensure the flawless execution of the armored advance. It is a statistical and professional impossibility that Kovac was the only man present who recognized a problem. Among the colonels and majors reviewing the march tables, there were undoubtedly officers who had seen contradictory reconnaissance photos. Men who had noticed the discrepancies in the road network, or who at least harbored a deep, nagging suspicion that the cartography was fundamentally flawed. Yet, as Patton dragged his grease pencil toward a catastrophic bottleneck, every single one of them remained completely mute. They were paralyzed by a toxic mixture of professional self-preservation and an overwhelming fear of the commander's legendary temper. In an environment where the general dictates reality through sheer force of will, contradicting that reality feels like insubordination. They rationalized their silence. They convinced themselves that the vanguard tank crews would somehow figure it out in the mud, or that pointing out a flaw was simply too dangerous for their own careers. This is the phenomenon of the command echo chamber, and it is one of the most lethal forces in warfare. When a leader becomes so intimidating that his staff is terrified to deliver bad news, the intelligence filter completely collapses. The staff stops analyzing the battlefield and simply starts confirming the commander's assumptions, stripping away vital warnings to offer only validation. When a headquarters operates in this vacuum of artificial agreement, an army marches blindly toward disaster. The senior officers in that tent had quietly chosen their careers over the truth, accepting a fatal logistical error rather than risking Patton's wrath. With the entire command structure paralyzed by fear, the burden of reality bypassed every silver eagle and gold oak leaf in the room. It fell squarely onto the shoulders of the lowest-ranking enlisted man to step across the invisible line of military discipline, approach the general's table, and prepare to prove exactly why the most feared commander in Europe was wrong. The wooden floorboards creaked sharply as Kovac stepped completely out of the shadows. That was the only sound in a canvas command post filled with 30 senior officers who had effectively stopped breathing. The corporal did not pause to salute. He did not offer a trembling apology for breaking the sacred chain of command, nor did he try to soften the blow with military pleasantries. He simply walked straight up to the master planning table, directly invading the personal operational space of a 3-star general. Patton did not move a muscle. He stood perfectly still, his jaw set, his pale eyes locked onto the young draftee who had just bypassed an entire room of decorated combat veterans to challenge his tactical blueprint. Kovac leaned over the massive acetate overlay, illuminated by the harsh glare of the overhead incandescent bulbs. He did not offer a hesitant theory or a philosophical argument about strategy. He applied the cold, merciless logic of a civilian engineer. Reaching across the board, he placed his index finger directly on the bottom right corner of the master map, tapping the tiny, easily ignored text buried deep in the cartographic legend. He stated the publication date out loud, 1932. Keeping his voice entirely steady, Kovac dragged his finger up the paper, tracing the bold blue line of Patton's proposed armored advance. He explained that the route currently drawn in grease pencil led straight into a geographical ghost. He pointed directly to the spot where the old road intersected the riverbed, stating clearly that the post-flood reconstruction had permanently erased that entire transit corridor. Then, moving his finger nearly a mile to the southwest, he tapped a completely blank patch of paper on the outdated map. He told the commander of the Third Army that this empty void was where the heavy concrete bypass actually sat. That was where the armor needed to pivot. That was the only place the infrastructure could physically support the crushing weight of a mechanized column. The tension inside the tent reached an absolute, suffocating peak. This was the ultimate collision of military authority and objective reality. George F. Patton's ego was legendary. It was the driving, relentless engine of his entire command philosophy. In this rigid, rank-obsessed hierarchy, admitting a fundamental operational error pointed out by a 22-year-old clerk could be perceived by his staff as a fatal crack in his armor. The surrounding colonels and majors braced for the inevitable volcanic explosion. They waited for the general to tear the corporal apart for gross insubordination, to banish him from the headquarters, and to stubbornly force the advance forward out of sheer, unyielding pride. Instead, Patton looked down. He leaned his heavy frame over the planning table, his face just inches from the paperboard. He meticulously studied the publication date in the corner. He traced his own finger over the contour lines, silently cross-referencing the topography with the invisible route Kovac had just mapped out in the blank space. For several agonizing seconds, the most aggressive combat commander in the European theater blocked out the entire room and simply analyzed the geometry of the Earth. Then, Patton slowly straightened up. He did not yell, he did not slam his fist on the table or throw his grease pencil. He looked up, locking eyes with the circle of sweating, paralyzed senior officers. In a perfectly calm, measured voice, he broke the heavy silence. He is right. There was no theatrical sigh of relief. There was no cinematic applause or sweeping monologue about the virtues of honesty. The crisis of ego simply evaporated the moment the geographical facts were verified. Patton instantly turned to his lead operations officer and ordered the intricate march tables to be adjusted immediately. The blue grease pencil lines were quickly wiped away, the new coordinates were plotted, and the massive logistical machinery of the Third Army pivoted to match the physical reality of the French terrain. The briefing moved forward, relentlessly and aggressively, as if a catastrophic disaster had not just been cancelled by a single terrifying moment of insubordination. The next morning, before the cold French fog had even lifted off the fields, the spearhead of the Third Army rolled out. Hundreds of Shermans, half-tracks, and supply trucks surged along the revised coordinates, completely bypassing the steep drainage embankments of the abandoned 1930s transit corridor. The vanguard hit the concrete bypass on schedule, their tracks gripping stable ground, and the offensive pressed forward without a single vehicle dropping its momentum. We can never calculate the exact number of American soldiers who survived that freezing morning because of a surveyor's intervention. You cannot put a precise casualty figure on an ambush that never happened, nor can you measure the blood saved by a traffic jam that was successfully erased from a march table. But the military command structure has a very specific way of acknowledging the quiet cancellation of a disaster. The following day, without a parade, without a brass band, and without a formal ceremony in front of the headquarters staff, a written order landed on Daniel Kovac's desk. It was signed by the Army commander, officially promoting him to the rank of sergeant. George S. Patton was a man who rarely tolerated dissent and almost never accepted criticism from his subordinates. Yet, in that brief moment of insubordination, he recognized something far more critical than a simple eye for topographical detail. He had not just rewarded a clerk for technical competence, he had promoted a man for possessing the moral courage to speak an uncomfortable truth. The true weight of that promotion lies in the damning contrast it exposed within the command post. The field-grade officers standing around that planning board had chosen the safety of their own careers, wrapping themselves in silence while a flawed order moved toward execution. But Patton understood a cold, unforgiving reality of mechanized warfare. The price of a staff officer's silence is never paid by the men standing inside a warm briefing room. It is paid in blood by the soldiers trapped inside the machines. Sometimes, the most valuable asset in a war is not a higher rank, but the courage to tell a commander that his map does not match the earth. Ultimately, the most valuable person in a wartime command post is rarely the one with the most stars on their collar. It is the one willing to stand up in a quiet room and say that the map does not match the earth.